a farmer in the west of England who doesn't use the internet, never had a mobile phone, like not particularly old, just not interested, doesn't want the internet, has a nice life. He just found somebody in his local town and just paid them to do it online for him. And it's so people often find these workarounds themselves. So I think you have to provide the workarounds, but also recognize some people just don't want to use online services. That feels very odd to somebody who spends their career with digital in their title. But we need to build for everybody.
Hi, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, T+. Here with me are Tom Reed and Audrey Tang. We've talked about how to deliver efficient public digital services. And now, let's continue our conversation. So Tom, I know you've worked at the Ministry of Justice, where you led reforms to modernize how technology is used in prisons. How did you carry out this work?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little while ago now, but I was the Chief Digital and Information Officer for the UK's Ministry of Justice. And we looked at digitizing a lot of processes across courts, legal aid, but also, as you say, prisons. Prisons are a fascinating area because they're kind of been bypassed by the digital revolution. So they're not. A lot of the processes are quite similar to how they were in Victorian times in the UK. And what we were looking at is how can we take the prison experience, which is like fundamentally intended to not be a terribly pleasant experience. It's intended to be a punishment, but also it's intended to be somewhere that you rehabilitate people. So what we looked at is what are the objectives, what are the outcomes that society is looking for from that process? So there's punishment, but there's also, you want people to come out of prison and be unlikely to reoffend. You want them to reintegrate into society. And a lot of the way that prison works is it shuts all of the doors for people. It teaches people how to operate in prison, but it stops them from being able to operate out in the real world. And there's three main drivers for rehabilitation, according to our data. The first is maintaining contact with your family. The second is having somewhere stable to live when you leave. And third is getting a job. And if even one of those is not there, then you're very likely to end up back in prison. And nobody wants that because necessarily, if you're back in prison, you've committed a crime and there's a new victim. So what we looked at is how can we use the time people have in prison, particularly the last 6 to 9 months, to prepare them for the outside world. So some of that was teaching basic literacy skills. So we provided technology to people in prison so they could just learn English and learn to read and write properly, so they're more likely to be able to get a job. We also looked at how we can make it easier for them to keep in contact with their family and their loved ones, because again, we want them to keep those contacts because then they won't reoffend. A lot of people are in prison a long way from where they previously lived, and their family are often quite poor because the main earner is in prison often. So we looked at how we can use video communications like we're doing here to allow people to have visits without their family having to travel 200 miles. A lot of initiatives like this, just to see how we can nudge people towards a better outcome.
Okay, Tom, you've talked about the importance of autonomy for people in prison. How can you build for autonomy with technology?
Yeah, autonomy is a really interesting thing. Again, it's preparing people for leaving prison. So the worst thing you can do when somebody's in prison is teach them to be helpless. So learned helplessness. So if you they're obviously in a cell, but also in a block. Somebody comes around, asks them to fill in a form to say what they want for lunch. They tell them this is where you're going to be tomorrow. This is your education. This is your sports or anything like that. What we wanted is to give the prisoners the opportunity to look after their own affairs. So we piloted having these lightweight laptops in cells that allowed them to do things like book their own visits, choose how they spend their limited money inside, book their own sort of education courses and their own exercise regimes. And what it did is it gave some power back to the prisoner. It's also really helpful because then you're getting the prisoner to do a lot of the administration that otherwise we're asking a prison officer to do. So it works both sides. But those were some of the ways that we tried to get autonomy back to people.
Yeah, I think it's really important that no one gets left behind. And in Taiwan, for quite a few years now, we have this idea of broadband as a human right, meaning that we not only have to provide very inexpensive access to broadband internet to all areas, but also through digital opportunity centers and even empowering the local social workers and care providers for the elderly and so on, make sure that people do not actually feel that they have to learn a lot of very esoteric technology and tools and so on, but instead we bring the services to them instead of asking them to adapt to technology. And through that, we use a crowdsourcing website called join.gov.tw that anyone can start a e-petition, and any petition that receives 5,000 counter signatures gets an immediate response and a ministerial response if it warrants interagency communication. So for example, the Hakka people or the people speaking Daigi started a petition saying, our characters are not even displayed on certain handheld devices or mobile operating systems. And then it's up to the Ministry of Culture, Education, and our ministry to talk to those vendors to make sure that they do not get left behind when the next update comes, the Unicode standard. They do not have to learn those standards or technological jargons, but rather because of the petition, we have to work with the people to empower them.
Indeed, participation is key to empowering people. But, Audrey, could you tell us more specifically how cross-department collaboration work in Taiwan?
Certainly. So the idea, very simply, is that any ministry that's in charge of any petition in the joint platform can simply say, but I can only do this part of the puzzle. I require more help. For example, the Ministry of Education is in charge of getting the scholarly access, right, to which characters needs to be included and so on. But we are, the MODA, the Ministry of Digital Affairs, are the ones who actually talk to the Unicode Consortium and to the operating system providers. And so we need to work closely together. But that's not all, because there are many cultural assets that are actually in analog form only. So for that, the Ministry of Culture have to work with the community to not just digitalize them, but also update our code books and so on. So it can actually include the existing written material that was there that may be overlooked by the MODA or the MOE and so on.
What about you? Tom, how did you do this cross-department work in the UK?
Yeah, it's really hard. I suspect it's easier if you're a minister like Audrey is, but I'm a civil servant, so it is quite challenging. And so I'll talk about the reasons it's challenging, and then how we get it to work. So the reasons it's challenging is all of the structures in UK government are kind of set up for departmental autonomy. So accounting officers, permanent secretaries are in charge of their budgets. They're accountable to Parliament, and they have. They are over-programmed generally. They have a lot that they want to transform. Their ministers have their own portfolio that they want to deliver on. And so trying to get departments to really lean into cross-government initiatives. And a lot of digital services, honestly, they span multiple government departments. So you need everyone to be in the tent. You need everybody to be working on the same problem. It's quite hard to get that up the priority list. The good thing, though, is the vast majority of people I've met work in government because they want to make life easier for citizens. They want to make life easier for the end user. That's why people work here. It's why we don't work, for, I'm not going to name companies, but why we don't work in the private sector is because everyone has this civic mindset that they're trying to do public good. And I think if you try to tap into that and create a community of practice, a community of people who really want to achieve the same things, you can often get past those sort of bureaucratic blockers. And we've had great success recently just by changing our attitude in the center of government to department. So rather than saying, we must do this, we're mandating this is the rule, we go out and say, let's collaborate, let's work together and design something together. Because your users better than I do. And we have the power at center to make some things happen. So I think changing from the center being telling people what to do to saying we can enable you. That's showing the biggest difference in my world.
Right. What I hear from you is that the ability of organizations to be flexible is what leads to their success. Can you tell us more about your time at the Ministry of Justice?
So the Ministry of Justice partners closely with our Home Office, which runs the police, and with our Attorney General's office, which runs, Crown prosecution and those sorts of things. But prisons themselves, a lot of it was just working out what are the real rules and legislation, and what are we allowed to do. So a story I might share is when COVID hit, we had a real problem that we had to stop prison visits. So people stopped visiting people in prison. And that has a couple of knock-on effects. One is the longer term I talked about breaking the relationships with family. But a bigger problem really is if you're in prison, it's a pretty bad place to be. And one of the few things you have to look forward to is seeing somebody. What we wanted to do is just implement video visits. And initially, all of the answers were absolutely not. You cannot put video in prison. You'd be able to see into people's homes. They could commit crime somehow. People in prison, people on the other end, we'd be able to see into the prison. What we found is when we worked through it, a lot of the rules weren't actually there. They were just mythology. And because there was a real need for the people who are running the prisons to improve morale amongst the prisoners, they were fine with it, and they okayed it. And then we had these amazing benefits from this tiny bit of digital transformation that we didn't expect. So I saw a video of one man who had been in prison for about 8 years, and he hadn't seen inside his house for 8 years, and he hadn't seen his family dog since it was a puppy. And it just changed his whole approach to being incarcerated, because he was just like, he actually saw what the outside world was like again. And it wasn't a benefit that we ever saw coming. We wanted just to replicate, visiting a prison and having a chat. But this changed everything for this person. And so I think you just got to challenge all of these rules and just really, really try these things. And then you see all these benefits you didn't expect.
That was very insightful. Audrey, turning to your corner of the world, I want to ask, what are digital services like in Taiwanese prisons?
Yeah, the same remote visit system that was set up during the pandemic as well. But interestingly, because the MODA, our ministry, is in charge of the spectrum allocation, cybersecurity, and service design, sometimes the Minister of Justice come for us for one thing and stay for the other two. One example, the MOJ a couple of months ago asked us whether it's possible to dedicate the 5G frequency so that the inmates in the prisons can use a dedicated 5G network. And that will massively reduce the cost of setting up Ethernet or Wi-Fi or things like that. So it's just a purely cost-saving thing, so that they can, for example, make sure that when there's a family in-person visit, the inmate can just walk by themselves to meet a family with dignity, a sense of freedom, and so on, without somebody walking beside them, right? And so that is all well and good. But then we sent our service design team, and then we discovered that there's many other things, right? We should have a kiosk instead of just filing those paper forms in order to buy supplies, and so on and so forth. So with our service design team, then our cybersecurity and many other teams get into the process. And exactly as Tom said, we basically said, okay, we're here to empower you. So the real need comes from the prisons and the inmates, and we'll just deliver whatever technological pilot size and so on if you have a clear need for that.
And do you mind if I ask a follow-on question,
Sure.
Audrey? Are there parts of the population in Taiwan who would be upset about that you're making life too easy for people in prison?
Well, basically, we explain that this is a strong authentication system that will ensure the safety and the non-violence, right, in the prisons and so on. And so worded in those security and cybersecurity terms,
Right.
people are generally okay with it. If we say, oh, we're just doing human-centered service design, then maybe not so much.
Yeah, very similar.
Tom, same question for you. Were the reforms you were pushing in prisons controversial in the UK?
it is a difficult area in the UK because I don't think politicians win a lot of votes by saying we're going to make life easier for prisoners, but equally nobody wants more offending. People want people to be rehabilitated. So you've got this slight paradox that it's quite difficult to get your politicians to talk a lot about prisons and how we improve them, but it is such an important area. Not an area I work in anymore, but it's still, as you can tell, something I care about very deeply.
It reminds me of a quote by Fyodor Dostoevsky: "The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." Something to ponder. And next, I want to talk about the importance of diversity among digital service builders. Tom, you have previously talked about the importance of diversity in the teams you work with. Why do you think it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll do diversity and inclusion separately because I think they're related but different things. Having diverse teams in digital is important for a whole host of reasons. There's really obvious ones, which are like, it is just the right thing to do. We should be representative. But also, most people who use government services a lot, they don't necessarily look and sound like me. I don't use government services very much at all. Like, I renew my passport sometimes and a driver's license and things, but I don't use government services very much. So we run a risk of designing things from this bubble of people, of quite privileged people who don't actually look, sound, understand different communities. So if we encourage a much more diverse mix of people, we're more likely to get slightly different perspectives and not end up in that sort of design echo chamber. So there are some quite practical reasons that I'm keen on doing it as well. I said I was going to separate diversity and inclusion. So diversity for me is about putting in a lot of extra effort to make sure that you are not just recruiting from the easiest pipeline. Like, it is the easiest thing in the world just to recruit a load of white men, particularly into technical roles. It takes more effort to go out and find people from less represented criteria, less represented areas, either from ethnicity or from socioeconomic groups or just gender. It does take more effort. Inclusion is where I'm focusing a lot of my effort, though, because I think diversity is mostly about recruitment. But if you get a diverse workforce, but you don't create an authentically inclusive environment, what you do is you force those diverse groups of people to act a certain way to fit in, or you make an exclusionary environment where people come in and they don't last very long. They leave again because they don't feel welcome. They don't feel like they can be themselves. So it takes a lot of effort to build a genuinely inclusive culture that welcomes everybody, has quite clear rules. You can't just have no rules, quite clear rules, but makes people feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, and they don't feel the need to assimilate into the sort of the larger, the dominant culture.
That's a very interesting perspective. Could you give us a specific example?
Yeah, so I mean, from a diversity perspective, what we've done is looked at the data. So we know that, for example, we have quite a good gender balance across the organization at all levels, but we have a gender pay gap, which is deeply problematic, and we have a disproportionate number of men in technical roles. So what we're doing there is we're putting more effort into going out and making sure that every time we recruit, we have a diverse panel. So we never have all male interview panels. We try to advertise through networks of, women who code and those sorts of networks to encourage more people to come in. And we're trying to make sure that where we're promoting people, we look really carefully at all the different things that people are adding. So what are they adding to our culture? What are they adding to as well as to delivery? So we looked at that's an example in gender. We're doing the same for a lot of protected characteristics. So we're doing the same for ethnicity, from social background, and so on. Another initiative we're just piloting at the moment is neurodiverse friendly recruitment. So I don't know how recruitment's done in Taiwan, but in the UK, if you're autistic, it's basically your worst nightmare. So you arrive, you have to look people in the eye for an hour. You have to respond on the spot to questions you haven't seen in advance, and you have to promote this extroverted, confident sort of persona. And then we take these people and we want them to be our lead engineers or whatever. It's a really bad way of doing it. So we're looking at how we can make that process much easier for people who are neurodiverse. So things like providing the questions in advance, allowing them to do interviews that aren't face-to-face, that are just audio only. And we're going to see whether this increases the number of people coming through and people who flourish when they're in our organization.
Audrey, I want to pass the question to you. How do you promote diversity at the Ministry of Digital Affairs?
Yeah, although we're a very new ministry, our team actually come from like 5 different ministers' teams, right? There's this National Communication Commission, there's the Department of Cybersecurity, the National Development Council on Data, the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and so on. So everything requires like 4 or 5 different perspectives in order to actually get a whole picture so that everybody can be on the same page. And so to foster the sense of inclusion, I think mutual support, we have this idea called plurality, which means collaboration across diversity. That is mandatory, really. The only thing we don't tolerate is not tolerating other people. And so we require, for example, it's already the case that most of the examination for public service is in the written form, so friendly to people on the spectrum and so on. But especially for the cybersecurity on, people say that it's much easier. Actually, you just throw us into a simulation of the blue team situation and let us just have a real-time like defense with the pre-recorded script that was based on something that actually happened to Taiwan maybe this early August, right? And that is a something that is a real feedback from people who know that it's easier to talk with other subject matter experts through a simulation rather than through face-to-face interview and so on. And so I think the examination branch in the government is really friendly to us, and they are open for the examination and recruitment process to be this kind of assessment by subject matter experts based on the modalities that they prefer.
Thank you for those inspiring words. Before we go, do either of you have any questions for each other?
Would you like to go first, Audrey, or shall I go?
Yeah, please.
So if somebody tripled your budget, what would you do first?
Great, because our budget was just tripled with the forward-looking infrastructure budget. So with the extra budget we actually received, we will do mostly 2 things. One I already talked about is to increase the resilience, because this idea of diversity in vendors, so that for 2 adjacent layers of government infrastructure, like the authentication, identity, the management of devices, and the network topology, and the cloud hosting, and so on, we don't use the same vendor for 2 adjacent layers. So this has a direct result of not locked in by any particular vendor, and that we can plug and play services. If the vendor threatens to raise the rent, so to speak, we simply switch to the solution that is provided by the adjacent layer. But to do this kind of topology requires a lot of upfront investment, because although the vendors say they are interoperable, often those interoperability isn't even tested. So we often become the first ones, our architects, that actually put those services together. But with the blessing of the parliament and the budget, that's what we're actually doing as part of the push for zero trust architecture and advanced cybersecurity and resilience. So resilience through plurality, that's our first push. And the other one is to work with more civic tech people, right? Previously, we only had 5 winning teams of presidential hackathon every year that received the presidential trophy that carries the promise promise of the budget, personnel, and regulation to scale their local experiment to the national scale. But that was because our bandwidth was really limited. But nowadays, with extra budget, we can actually afford to work with crowdfunding communities through quadratic funding and many very interesting experiments to get the impact investors in. So we have the resource for 100 or at least 20 more as compared to the 5 teams per year for presidential hackathon. And so that's what we're pushing forward. It's a joint collaboration with the impact investor, the social entrepreneur, and so on to scale the bandwidth even more compared to the previous presidential hackathon. So it will be fun. So yeah, and this is a really nerdy like policy question. So feel free to not use that. So just recently, actually a week ago, we passed the Public-Private Partnership Act amendment that classified the digital infrastructures as something that's subject to the BOT or BTO or whatever formula, so that we can actually work with a private vendor to build something that's a digital public infrastructure, I don't know, like Twitter, and then maintain the operation of it via the government. It's such an idea attractive in the UK or with the GDS, or have you already tried something like that before?
Can you explain it a bit more?
Yeah, sure.
And then
So in classical concrete infrastructure, like things actually made out of concrete, it's useful to actually, instead of allocating any budget, to work with a private vendor and they operate or build the entire thing, like a public park or something like that. And then they have this license period of a few years where they get to keep the income from running the market or something like that, or subleasing it and so on. But at the end of those 5 years, 6 years, or whatever, the maintenance goes back to the government, and the government then keep the control of the infrastructure. So this is quite popular to build the public infrastructures in the municipalities that need it, but without the financial means to do so. So we just passed in the parliament a law that applied this to the digital infrastructures. But frankly speaking, we don't have a lot of experience in this kind of collaboration with the private sector, so that they will work with the civic sector together in a kind of participatory way, but they still operate and keep most of the profit, but with the understanding that after a few years, it will be essentially nationalized. So like, have you heard of the idea, or what will it sound like in the GDS context?
It's a really interesting idea. So if you look at other countries around the world who are very progressive in digital, some of them are a lot further along that road than we are. So again, Denmark has a really, 4 or 5 companies that they work very collaboratively with to build and run public services. And they are really closely working in that partnership. I was in Korea recently, and they have a really amazing sort of ecosystem of private sector suppliers that they're using, and they're making private APIs available to those services to try, exactly as you say, to try to run and maintain these things in the private sector, but in a joint partnership. In the UK, not so much. If you wind the clock back 15 years. Most of our digital services and our tech was outsourced, like wholly outsourced. And a lot of CIOs across government were sort of operating almost as chief commercial officers rather than CIOs. And, so you'd have a company that they ran your data center, they owned the tin, they operated the applications, they designed the interface layer, the web layer with the system. And so when GDS was set up, it was a swing the other way. And the rule was, all of the things you need to really care about, you keep in-house. So your core architecture, your product, your design, we do in-house, and we outsource only the things that are commodity. So like, we try not to build data centers anymore. We use the public cloud. My digital identity program, we're not building our own facial recognition. There's off-the-shelf software that we've integrated. But we keep the sort of the architectural brain in-house. it may be nearly time that we start to rebalance that. So wholesale outsourcing, doing everything in-house, it may be time that we start to look at whether we can partner more and really partner better with the private sector rather than it being a supplier-customer relationship. So again, I think that's something I'm going to take away and think about.
Yeah, interoperable standards and no lock-ins. If that is honored, I think more partnership is possible. And we're all figuring this out together. So I guess also Taiwan can help.
Agree.
We've been talking about how to make sure that digital services work for everyone. If you want to hear more from Tom Reed and Audrey Tang, check out our previous episode, where they talked about innovation, data, and digital ranking. And if you like today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think. See you next time on Innovative Minds.
So hi, I'm Tom Reed. I'm the Chief Executive of the Government Digital Service in the UK, and see you on Taiwan Plus.
Hello, I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Digital Minister. See you on Taiwan Plus.